in the wake of the COVID crisis, parents woke up from their stupor, realized that they had to take matters into their own hands. Young people come into the world burning to learn. That desire to learn doesn't turn itself off. We turn it off with our coercive system of schooling. Why don't we have the choice, the level of choice in education that we have in all other consumer decisions in all other parts of our lives?
Welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast, the place to be, to live free and prosper in a world of uncertainty. We're on a mission to reach over 50,000 subscribers to get these bold, uncensored conversations out into the world. If you subscribe, here's my promise to you. Each and every week, I'll bring you courageous guests, profound insights, and the truth that most are too afraid to say out loud. So, if you're with us, please hit subscribe and let's build something that truly matters. Today's topic is dear to my heart. The education system as we know it is failing, and parents are beginning to wake up. Classrooms built on conformity and one-size-fits-all curriculum are leaving kids uninspired and ill-prepared for real life. But what if there's a better way? Today, I'm joined by Kerry McDonald, education entrepreneur, advocate, and author of the groundbreaking new book, Joyful Learning. Together, we explore the explosive rise of homeschooling, microschools, and innovative alternative approaches to education. We'll break down the myths, share practical advice, and uncover why more families than ever are choosing to take control of their children's education. If you've ever felt that there must be more to education than traditional schooling, then this episode is for you. A quick time out, because if you've been questioning the systems shaping our world, then you'll love what we've created with The Thinking Society. The Thinking Society is a 6-week online course designed to help you sharpen your critical thinking, spot bias and manipulation, and make sense of the chaos without losing your mind or your relationships. You'll learn directly from brilliant minds like Sinead Stringer, David Sherrill-Ambos, and Dr. David Thunder, and join a community of people who actually want to think for themselves. Head to weareelevate.org/thinking society or hit the link in the description to learn more and sign up today. Kerry, welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. I'm delighted to be having you here with us today to have this important discussion. So many of our audience in the UK, we've got a global audience, but our listener base is largely UK orientated, and the last 5 years has really spawned an interest in alternative education and different models and how we can really, a lot of people looking at how they can escape the British education system, quite frankly. But we found ourselves in a quite a different position to where you guys have done in the US, where you've got a lot more options. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about what some of those options are so we can actually learn from you guys and also explore how you got to that place from a place which may well have started where we are, with heavy regulation, lots of prohibition, so that we can learn how we can break through and kind of embrace these entrepreneurial models that are kind of rife in the US right now. So welcome to the show. Look forward to getting into our discussion.
Oh, it's great to be here, Dan. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so a springboard as part of this discussion as well was that we saw that you had a new book coming out, which, you know, when we read the title and the premise, first and foremost, we said this is right up our street. We must talk about this book. So to kind of give us a grounding and a context for our discussion today, would you mind just telling us a little about your new book that's on its way out and will be available later this year in the UK?
Yes, the new book that's available for pre-order now and will be on bookstore shelves in August is called Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. It's being published by the large publisher Hachette, and it really focuses on the entrepreneurial parents and teachers, largely in the US, that are creating these innovative education models, things like homeschooling collaboratives, low-cost private schools, micro schools, which could be operating as, again, kind of homeschool collectives or as private schools, virtual platforms, a whole assortment of different education options, some of which were emerging, pre-COVID, pre-2020, both in the US and beyond, but really took off in the wake of school closures and remote learning and all of the disruption occurring beginning in 2020. And so this book really profiles all of these everyday entrepreneurs who are creating these new options for families. And it's also focused for families who are looking for something beyond their assigned government school. So it's really the audience of prospective founders, people who want to create new schools and spaces, as well as parents looking to find these new schools and spaces. And as so often happens, these parents can't find what they're looking for. So, like true entrepreneurs, they go off and build it. And it's really a takeoff or a spinoff of my earlier book, Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that was published in the spring of 2019, that looked at sort of the growth and diversification of the home education movement and the kind of early emergence of what we call microschools, I think more commonly in the UK called pod schooling, or again, these sort of intentionally small, highly individualized learning environments. And so now we're just sort of seeing that expansion of these early, roots of education innovation occur all over. It's such an exciting time.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. I mean, there's an age-old principle in entrepreneurship, which is about market timing, and both of those books couldn't be better timed. I mean, having Unschooled come out the year before what we went through during COVID almost created a roadmap for people who face this unprecedented set of choices. But both in terms of school closures, where people didn't want to have to have their children's education sacrificed. And this has been a major driver for us in the UK about how we approach education. And the entrepreneurial, whether people would have attributed that term to themselves, certainly creative, innovative ways that people managed to pull people together to homeschool clubs, just phenomenal what people, the resilience and the creativity that enable people to actually make sure that their children could continue their education. But then the second big driver, I think, Kerry, and this is a bit more politicized, but I think people weren't necessarily happy, or a proportion of the population weren't happy with the way that the government were inflicting certain rules and regulations within schools in response to COVID. So people were actually, even if the schools were open, they were pulling their kids out because they were worried about what their children were being exposed to. And I know it's not limited to those things. We live in a world where social and cultural issues are now becoming prevalent in schools. So we've kind of got this idea that schools are either regurgitation or indoctrination machines.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, Dan. One of my favorite quotes that I think is so relevant to this conversation, and certainly what we're seeing in education and in other sectors as well, comes from the Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman. And he wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." The ideas that are lying around. And so in the wake of the COVID crisis, actual or perceived, the ideas lying around in education were things like home education, which had been increasingly popular in the US and in the UK, as well as other places around the world. Microschools, pod schooling, again, these sort of personalized education models that were starting to sprout pre-COVID, and that then really took off. And I think a lot of the reason that they took off was because, like you said, parents sort of woke up from their stupor a bit. And, I think for a lot of families, they just sort of went about the motions of sending their children to an assigned government school, didn't think too much about it. And then when those schools were shut down, certainly in the US, for significantly longer than they were for you in the UK. And in some areas of the US, I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, shut down for, months and months and months. And then even when they returned, were hybrid models. So they weren't even open full time, and lots of remote schooling, lots of disruption. And I think parents just grew sick of that and realized that they had to take matters into their own hands. So they kind of poked their head up to see what else was available for their children's education. And all of a sudden they spotted these ideas lying around, these things like homeschooling, pod schooling, microschools, and then realized that they could create their own. And in fact, in many cases, they could do things better than the government schools were doing them.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's been a fascinating period. And just on the school closures, it's really interesting. Prior to my current show, I had a show called The Pandemic Podcast, and we did over 1,000 episodes, kind of pulling apart every detail of the COVID response. But I actually had a member of the SAGE, the UK SAGE Scientific Advisory Board,
Yeah.
on the show. And he was one of the people that was involved in providing evidence to whether the schools should be shut down in the UK. He was a father, his children were in school. And, he was very professional in his interview. And he made his points, but when we finished and the camera stopped rolling, he broke down into tears, saying that he wished he could have done more in his professional capacity as a SAGE advisor to prevent the shutdown of schools. And he felt personally culpable for the erosion of children's education during that time, which I had to empathize with the guy. Even though on one hand, partly responsible for what happened, and on the other hand, you could see the humility. But underneath all of that was the suffering that the children went through. But as a result of that, the resilience, as we said, the adaptability. And you're right, there was prior to COVID a growing movement for homeschooling, but this thrust the issue into people's homes so rapidly. And because if you've already got a history of being interested in homeschooling, you've learned a little bit about it. For the rest of the parents.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing now, Dan, is are the sort of network effects that are occurring now 5 years later. So even just looking at some of the data in the UK regarding home education, the data that I found looks like there's over 125,000 students being home educated. In the UK, that's a 60% increase from pre-COVID days, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing. Lots of increases each year, and the number of families choosing home education. We see similar trends here in the US, an acceleration in many places of homeschooling when a lot of people thought, during the kind of peak COVID year and school closures and remote learning, we might have a blip in rising interest in homeschooling, but that'll go back to normal. And we just haven't seen that here. We have increasing rates of homeschooling, increasing rates of private schooling, private education more generally, and declining rates of government schooling that go beyond just sort of predicted demographic changes and falling U.S. birth rates, where we knew public government-run schooling would decline in terms of enrollment, but that decline has even been more significant than was predicted because more families are choosing these more private market-based options. And, so I think it's interesting just to see that growth in interest from families. And then as more families choose home education, alternative educational models, and more entrepreneurs create those models, we see those network effects so that more families say, home education is an option for me. I should look into this. And my neighbor's doing it. My friend is doing it. And their kids are thriving and happy, flourishing. And then, you see certainly here in the US, a lot of entrepreneurial parents and teachers creating these new schools and spaces. And then other prospective entrepreneurs, these founders, realize they can do it too. And that's certainly the feedback that I've been getting. I run a twice weekly podcast called The Liberated Podcast, where I interview these entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are creating these new spaces and schools. And, I hear over and over again from new founders, well, it was from listening on your podcast or in my articles of these other founders who were doing this work, creating a home-based micro school or some other low-cost private education option. And I said, I can do this too, and so I think we're just at the beginning of this movement, largely because of these network effects for both families and founders.
That's amazing. And I must introduce you to some of the women that I've had the pleasure of interviewing in the last few weeks on this, because my dear friend Daisy has a school called Reimagine. She's also working on a project called Cultivate Learning. There's the Griffin School in the UK, and all of these emerged as a result. Yeah, they emerged as a result of the pandemic. And I've personally gone to visit their establishments and looked at how they've set things up. And it's just incredible what they've done from a standing start. And it is that entrepreneurial mindset. If there's a problem and there's no viable solution, then we have to create it.
Yeah, I would love to be connected with them and have them on my show because it's just so inspiring to see this entrepreneurial spirit of here's a problem. We're not, families in our community are not satisfied with the government run schooling system for a whole host of reasons, and we can talk about some of that because I think there's a lot of commonality between what you're finding in the UK and what we have here in the US in terms of increased standardization and stagnation in education. And then you have these founders saying, well, I can go off and create a solution that families in my community really, really want. And the results are, these thriving children who are extremely successful and happy.
Quick break to tell you about the Thinking Society, our flagship course to help you reclaim your mind in a world of noise. Over the course of 6 weeks, you'll dive into the psychology of propaganda, cognitive bias, and the war on truth, and how to become radically better at thinking and seeing clearly in a world gone mad. If you're tired of being told what to think and ready to think deeply, independently, and courageously, this course is for you. Go to weareelevate.org/thinking society or click the link in the description to join us now. Now back to the episode. Absolutely. Kerry, I'm curious, what was it that sparked you to go on this journey for yourself? What was your breakout moment?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I went to government schools all the way through elementary and secondary education. And then when I went to college, I was an economics major. And it was through the lens of economics that I became interested in education policy, mainly because through the lens of economics, which of course is generally the study of how people make choices, I began to say, why don't we have the level of choice in education that we have in all other consumer decisions and all other parts of our lives? Why do we have so much choice, variety, and abundance in every other part of our lives? But it is in education, it's largely one size fits all. It's largely a government run monopoly on schooling. And it just seemed like such a disconnect, given the rest of our society and our culture. And so that was sort of what led me into becoming more and more interested in education. I began taking more education classes. And when I was still an undergraduate, I had a chance to shadow a homeschooling family who lived nearby. And this was really the first time I had ever encountered homeschooling. I'd never met a homeschooler. This was the late 1990s. Homeschooling had only become legally recognized in the US a few years prior, by the mid 1990s. And so it was still a relatively new phenomenon at the time in the late 90s, first time that the US government began tracking homeschooling data, counting about 850,000 homeschoolers at that time. Of course, now there's millions. So it was still somewhat in the margins of society, but I remember just being completely captivated by this home educating family and just seeing the way that they approach teaching and learning in a much more authentic and individualized way than certainly was my experience going through government schooling and that I had observed in government school classrooms when I was an undergrad doing various student teaching practicums. And so that really was what opened up my interest in exploring education policy further. I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard. And there, if you were interested in anything to do with school choice or education innovation or alternative education, you're really kind of directed into, at the time, the charter school movement, which we have here, which are basically taxpayer funded schools that are privately run, typically by nonprofit organizations. And that was sort of the early days of the expansion of charter schools. And so that's where I spent much of my time. But I still felt there was something more, again, from seeing this home educating family and wondering about that. And just not only, alternative schools, but alternatives to school in the way that home educating families approach teaching and learning. So I started writing more and more about alternative education models, had my own family. We chose home education for them. And alternative education more generally. And then, again, continue to write more about these topics. My book came out in 2019, and then COVID hit, and now, of course, so much more interest in these topics.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting enough, I also am an economics major and came to similar conclusions about many facets of society. And I would get into many different debates with my economics tutors, and they actually tried to get me to stay on to do my master's. And I said I'd rather go out in the real world and try and make a difference that way. But thank you. And it's interesting. I also went to a state school, and they were very nice state schools. I was very lucky where I went to school. My secondary school education was a grammar school, and they were always perceived as kind of better than the kind of comprehensive. Whether there's any truth to that, I don't know, but they're always perceived to be this almost elite type education establishment. I never knew really understand where that came from, but I had a pleasant time, frankly. But it took me about 10 to 20 years after education to really relearn who I am as a person, and embrace my own self-education to actually forge my own path. And it's only now in my early 40s that I actually feel I really understand myself and what I'm here to do. And I look back and I think actually a pleasant education versus something that actually sets me up for life are two different things. And that's my concern now as a father. My son is 3. He's in preschool at the moment. Well, he's not quite in preschool. He's in nursery education, and he's very lucky. We found a wonderful place that it really does nurture the individual, and it's very tailored and to their experience, and we're very grateful for that. But what comes after that, I'm worried about. Yeah. Because we do have limited options and certain constraints in the UK, although homeschooling, as you said, is growing. What do you think some of the misconceptions are around homeschooling for people who hear that word and recoil, that they have to give up their lives to stay at home and educate their children?
Yeah, I guess it's probably, what about socialization, right? That's always,
the big
one of the first questions that home educating families get asked. And I'm embarrassed to say it was the first question that I asked that homeschooling family that I shadowed, back in the late 1990s. And I cringe now thinking about that because, I've homeschooled now for over a decade. My oldest daughter is graduating, from homeschooling high school now, heading off to college in the fall. And so when I think about that question, I wish I could take it back, because it's just so obvious that the kind of socialization that we're talking about in home education is authentic socialization. It's being genuinely immersed in the people, places, and things of our communities, and separating education from schooling in really remarkable ways, really using all of those resources around us, digital resources, real life resources in our communities, mentors, people of all ages interacting in kind of multi-age spaces. That's just so special with home educating. And then, of course, in contrast to the sort of forced socialization that we see in conventional classrooms, age segregated classrooms, based on a child's birth year, and stagnant curriculum that's not tailored to individual needs and preferences. All of the things that I think now, so many people here in the US and in the UK are saying is really, there's really just this disconnect between how we approach education and the changes that we're seeing in the rest of our lives. We have so much personalization, innovation, customization in every other part of our lives, but in education, it's largely standardized and stagnant. And I think more and more parents, especially younger parents like you, with your 3-year-old, are saying, this isn't what I want for my kids. We live in this big wide world with all of this innovation and individualization. Why would I want my child's learning to contract into the 4 walls of a standardized conventional classroom?
No, absolutely. I mean, I was at an event recently locally where there was a number of different homeschool educators, and and many of them, interesting enough, were ex private school or public school educators who have escaped the system to do things differently. Yes. But I explained my concerns about my son going into school, and I always explained that he's very vivacious, he's very confident, he's very outgoing, vibrant, and I said my concern is that's going to get beaten out of him, not physically, but mentally, by the education system. And their face just went deadpan. And said, that's exactly why I left, because I saw children come in with genuine curiosity, zest for life, hunger, confidence, and have it sapped out of them to the point when they come at the end of the system, they're just quiet, obedient, compliant individuals that have learned to regurgitate information so they can pass their exams, and off they go into the machine. And I thought, my goodness, that was like an earthquake. That was like an actual earthquake under my feet as she said that. And I said, I have to look for different solutions. So I'm so pleased that there are people out there doing these things. But this kind of
Can
segues.
I just comment on that, Dan,
Yeah,
for just a
please.
moment?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I think that's so important. You mentioned the school teachers who've left the conventional classroom to, launch some of these new programs or to home educate their own kids. This is the trend that I see more often than not here in the US. I would say about 3/4 of the founders who are launching these new schools and spaces are former public school employees, former government-run school employees who grow fed up with, again, that one-size-fits-all model and decide they can do things different and better. They went into education because they love teaching and they love reaching young people where they're at, and they find that in the bureaucracy of the system, they're unable to do that. They're unable to sort of differentiate the curriculum or meet a child where they're at individually. And so they go off and create their own new models. And I just think it's such an exciting time to be able to see these new opportunities for educators. I think we forget sometimes that educators are as stifled in a conventional classroom as students. That their creativity is limited in a conventional classroom in the same way that students' creativity is stifled and is limited. And so these alternatives to conventional classrooms, sort of market-based, entrepreneur-driven educational models, are enabling both teachers and students to flourish.
Liberated pupils, liberated students. I love the sound of that. Teachers as well. There's a quote from Professor Peter Gray, and I made a note of this research psychologist, who says that children come into the world with a biological design to educate themselves. And I love that because I, as a young person, had a curiosity that I could never explain, and it's still a burning curiosity within me now. But I see it in my son, I see it in lots of young people. To what extent do you think that's true? Because I think there's the education system, to me, feels like it almost extinguishes that. It can extinguish that flame, that desire to learn, that desire to explore. And I listened to this fascinating podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger on the Tom Billio show, and they were talking about Daniel's. He talks a lot about existential crisis and how we can navigate this changing world. He's a fascinating guy, but he was homeschooled, and it's fascinating to hear about the choices his parents made. And it was purely because of that. They felt that his own desire, and you can see it in his work now, his own curiosity to explore the world would have been diminished in traditional education. So they chose a different path. So what extent do you think those young children of today have that innate desire to learn, that innate curiosity? How true is that, do you think?
Oh, 100%. I'm so glad you brought up Dr. Peter Gray. He wrote the foreword to my unschooled book
Oh, wow.
back in 2019, and he and I, together with some others, founded the Alliance for Self-Directed Education here in the U.S. that really promotes this idea of natural childhood learning and self-directed education and sort of models that go beyond the conventional classroom. So I'm a huge fan of his, and his book, Free to Learn, is a must read for anyone. He also has a fabulous Substack. And, you're right that Peter Gray will say young people come into the world burning to learn. And then he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, that desire to learn doesn't turn itself off when a child reaches 4 or 5 years old. We turn it off with our coercive system of schooling. That's what he says, and I would, entirely agree. And I think you alluded to this as well in your previous comment about what educators were seeing is that, and I hear this all the time from the founders that I interview, is that light will dim from a child's eyes as they go through the kind of conventional schooling system. That curiosity, that enthusiasm and energy for learning becomes dulled because it's not rewarded. It's not often seen as a positive, valued in a conventional classroom, right? That typically conventional classrooms reward obedience over originality and conformity over creativity. And I think it's it's even more important when we think about a world that we're entering now, which is much more AI enabled, and this is only the beginning of that transformation. What separates human intelligence from artificial intelligence? It's things like creativity, curiosity, originality, and entrepreneurial spirit, right? These are things that make us essentially human. And yet, these are the very qualities that are so often dulled or even destroyed within a conventional system of schooling that, again, focuses much more on obedience and compliance and conformity. So if we really want to, coexist and compete in a world that's increasingly defined by artificial intelligence, we should do everything we can to make sure our children are having those sort of essential human qualities, the essential piece of human intelligence cultivated and rewarded and cherished.
Kerry, I think there's a growing number of parents now who are becoming more aware of this now. And as a result, it's one of the primary drivers that people are looking to explore alternative education. They recognize that the education system, certainly in the UK, is almost built for the 1900s. It's the production line mentality. And there's this old adage that you go to school, you go to university, you get a job, then you die, and it's a job that you hate, then you die, and it's kind of the machine sets you up for that. And as a result, the education system hasn't really fundamentally changed here in the UK, and people are seeing that in order for their children to actually thrive in the modern world, they're going to need to go through a different set of experiences, but also to treat every single child as though they're the same, despite our complete multifaceted differences and uniqueness within each individual, which is just not recognized. So I think that has become a primary driver for parents to look at alternatives. What would you say are some of the other drivers or the top drivers that have led to this growth in desire for alternative education?
Yeah, first I'm gonna comment on that point because I think that's a huge driver. It's just this desire for sort of differentiated instruction, this recognition that we don't all learn the same things in the same way at the same time. That there's this variety in human development, which we somehow accept in all other areas of child development. Right? We say children will crawl at different times, walk at different times, talk at different times, and that's okay. But when it comes to learning addition and subtraction, for example, we expect that it's right here at this age, at this time, in this way with this curriculum. So I think one of the drivers for this increased interest in innovative, unconventional education options is the capacity, the resources available to us now that enable differentiated learning, right? I mean, we see the rise of different types of curriculum, often, free or low cost online curriculum that enables that sort of mastery based, self paced learning to occur, so that you might have a fourth grader or a 10-year-old in our vernacular that moves that's reading at a much higher level, secondary school level, but maybe their math is lower. Maybe they're a little bit quote unquote behind in math, behind other 10-year-olds in their classroom. And now we have the ability through this differentiated instruction and all of these online and other types of curriculum tools to enable that kind of customization in learning. So I think that's a huge driver. I think another big driver, and this is something we're seeing certainly in the US, and I was just reading about in the UK as well, the childhood and adolescent mental health crisis that's, of course, been exacerbated from the COVID response and school shutdowns and the kind of disconnection that so many young people felt during lockdowns, and that the impact of that continues, to a large degree. The quote, the stat that I saw in the UK recently is that over half of the parents choosing home education now in the UK are doing so for mental health reasons, that they're concerned about their children's mental health or other sort of special learning needs. And that's something we're seeing here in the US as well. Not only a desire to sort of retain a child's mental health and not, kind of have them go through this standardized or stifling system, but also if there is an issue, pulling their children out of a conventional classroom for an option that might be, better better help with their health and well-being. Similar to that, I think again we're seeing similar trends here in the US and the UK of families with neurodiverse learners, children who might have special learning needs. Maybe they're on the autism spectrum, or they've been diagnosed with ADHD or some other kind of dyslexia, some other sort of special learning need that is not being met well in a conventional standardized classroom. And now there's so many more options for families to be able to take their child out of that environment and find one that's much more suitable to their individualized needs. So I think that's another driver of this. I think another driver is what I was mentioning before, is just this desire for more personalization and education that we have everywhere else. I mean, just look at the apps on our smartphone. We have so much customization and curation, in so many other parts of our lives, and more parents want that in education for their kids as well. And then I'll say sort of another driver, certainly here in the US, it may be less so in the UK, but we have a dramatic increase in the growth in school choice policies, as we call them in the US, which is enabling education funding to follow students to whatever educational setting works best for them. We now have more than half US states have some form of private school choice that enable parents to withdraw their kids from a government-run school for a private option, including in many states homeschooling and homeschool collaboratives, tutoring and educational therapies, all kinds of different options to really unbundle education from schooling. And in now 15 US states, these policies are universal, applying to all school-age children. So that's been a huge expansion in school choice policies. Again, that was another idea lying around in the wake of COVID. These school choice policies were gaining popularity pre-2020 and have really skyrocketed since then.
Maybe we've got a lack of good ideas lying around here in the UK, because I think we're in a very different position. As that you're bragging, Kerry. We haven't got that over here. It's very different over here. The idea of having funding to support people in their educational choices here would be like a leap for us, a huge leap. At the moment, it's legally getting the opportunity to teach people or to educate children in a different format. We still can home educate at the moment, and homeschooling is certainly still permitted, but it feels like the walls are closing in the UK. It's frankly feels like we're going the opposite direction. So to hear that in America is fascinating and fantastic. And is that continuing under the I don't want to get partisan about this, but is this continuing under the new administration?
Yeah, I just say a couple things. I mean, in the US, homeschooling is legal in all 50 US states. But policies around home education and private education more generally vary by state. So in the US, education is a state issue.
Right.
The control of education lies at the state level. And so, while we see, for example, the growth in school choice policies nationally, the growth in these alternative education models are occurring everywhere, right? They're occurring in states with robust school choice policies. I would think of states like Florida and Arizona and Utah, maybe Texas soon. They're on the brink of passing a universal choice policy as well. But these new schools and spaces are sprouting even in states like mine, Massachusetts, that has no private school choice program and has none on the horizon. And yet we still see that entrepreneurial spirit rising in the wake of 2020 as more parents demand more options for their kids and more entrepreneurs step up to meet that demand. So, certainly there's an acceleration of these schools and spaces in states that have passed robust school choice policies, but it's not a requirement. And this is what's happening everywhere. And it sounds like it's happening, as you say, in the UK as well. I also have friends who home educate in the UK, including one of my dearest friends who home educates her 3 children. And she also says that there's this growth in pod schooling and these homeschool collaboratives, and as well as just independent homeschooling more broadly. So it's happening regardless regardless of policies. But, I think you're right that there are, sort of these levels of regulation or threats of regulation of home education and private education that are always present. And home education advocates are, always so good at pushing back against proposed regulation. One of the things we've seen in the US, thankfully, is a trend over the past couple of decades towards deregulation of home education. And this is occurring even at the same time that school choice policies are expanding. So even as we have education funding following students, including in some cases to homeschooling families, if they choose to partake in these programs, we still see at the same time a deregulation of home education nationally, which is really exciting to see. And that's not to say that there's not threats that sprout, periodically. Right now, for example, in the state of Illinois, we have a bill in the legislature there to create a homeschool registry, and that's very similar, it sounds, to what is happening in the UK with one of your pieces of legislation that's also looking for a homeschool register. And it's these types of bills that seek to limit parental choice in education, that seek to really repeal educational freedom and assert the power of the state over the family. And I think that they have to be aggressively fought back against through grassroots efforts.
A quick time out, because if you've been questioning the systems shaping our world, then you'll love what we've created with the Thinking Society. The Thinking Society is a 6-week online course designed to help you sharpen your critical thinking, spot bias and manipulation, and make sense of the chaos without losing your mind or your relationships. You'll learn directly from brilliant minds like Sinead Stringer, David Sherrill-Ambos, and Dr. David Thunder, and join a community of people who actually want to think for themselves. Head to weareelevate.org/thinking society or hit the link in the description to learn more and sign up today. Now back to the conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think what's fascinating from the entrepreneurial perspective, what do you think about Airbnb, on whether you like what they do or not, or the impact they've had on the world? The reality is there's a great story. I think Brian Chesky, one of the co-founders, tells how the legislation was not favorable to what they were doing, but they became so big or so great that you couldn't ignore them. And I think that is a classic entrepreneurial principle. And I think the same hopefully will be true in the education space, where these alternative models become so great that literally they cannot be ignored, because children are thriving, they're healthier, their mental health is improved, their education is improved, their well-being, their lifetime prospects improve, and thereby you create a model that cannot be ignored. That's my hope. Are you seeing that? Do you think that's a driver in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great example. I talk about Airbnb in my new book, Joyful Learning, that we're really sort of flooding the market right now with homeschoolers and with these, pod schools, micro schools, low cost private schools, so that it does become much more difficult to turn back the clock and to regulate these programs. That doesn't mean that some legislators, especially those that are tied to the schooling status quo, won't try to regulate these programs out of existence, or create programs that limit their autonomy. But I think, again, as long as we can build up that critical mass of families choosing something different for their kids, it'll be a tough political battle for those who would impose more controls.
Yeah, interesting enough, your reference of how you came to look at this from an economics point of view. It's so interesting, because even though I learned about the merits of free market economies as part of my own economic education, the state system is so strongly set in the UK. I barely applied that principle to the thinking around education for my own self-reflection. It was only later in life that became an occurrence. And actually, over the last 5 years, as we've been looking at this issue around alternative education and the barriers in the UK, it's really led me to, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but it's led me to think, how did the state become so involved in education? How did it become so constrictive? How did parents' rights to choose how their children grow up, how their very own flesh and blood get to be learning, how they experience, how they grow, and how they're nurtured? Now, I understand there's certain laws that need to be put in place to make sure they don't come to any physical harm. I understand that. But do you know what the history of education and how this became so centralized? How do we get here?
Yeah, I'm much more familiar with the U.S. Education history, but I think that there's some overlap with the U.K. as well. So for the U.S., our compulsory education laws date back to the 1640s, not long after the Pilgrims settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620, and not too long after that. The colonists created compulsory education laws that were then spread to the remaining colonies. But what these laws did was define a state interest in an educated citizenry. But the compulsion at the time was not on parents to send their kids to government-run schools. The compulsion was on cities and towns that were emerging to offer schooling resources. So for cities and towns of a certain size, they had to hire a teacher for families that wanted to use that service. If they were a larger city or town, they had to open and operate a grammar school. But again, the compulsion was on the municipality to offer educational resources for families that wanted them. And, home education was the default. And my understanding is that's been the default in the UK for quite a while as well, that the expectation is that the parents are in charge of their children's education. These school, options are available to you if you want to participate in them, but the parents have the right to raise and educate their children as they choose. That changed for us in the US, and I believe similar model in the UK as well, in the mid-19th century. So Massachusetts, again, my home state, leading the way in education compulsion yet again in 1852, when we passed the first compulsory attendance law. And at this time, now parents were required to send their children to a school under a legal threat of force. So these laws really had teeth in a way that compulsory education laws didn't. So we kind of switched from compulsory education compulsion on the part of the municipality to now compulsory attendance, with parents being forced to send their children to these common schools, as they were called. But was really interesting to see then, and I think we're seeing it to some extent now, is many families rebelled against these compulsory attendance laws. In the US, we had an influx of Irish Catholic immigrants into, again, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. And they didn't want to send their kids to these purportedly secular government schools, common schools, but that for all intents and purposes were reflective of the dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms at the time, with Anglo-Saxon Protestant teachers and texts. And Irish Catholic families rebelled and said, "We're not doing this. We're going to create our own system of Catholic parochial schools," and that's what they did. And so that was sort of, I think of that as sort of the beginning of kind of the more modern school choice movement of parents saying, we want education options to reflect our personal needs, preferences, and values. We don't want to send our kids to a school or a space that is not aligned with our values and viewpoints. And again, in every other consumer area of our lives, we're able to do that, right? We're able to shop at restaurants, eat at restaurants, or shop at stores that buy, cars, or, move to neighborhoods that reflect, kind of what we're looking for, our distinct needs and preferences. And we're able to do that in a market-based economy. And with education, that hasn't been the case up until now.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, my Irish activist friends tell me that they're the original rebels, so that rang true in that story too. So, yeah, I'm not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater. It's probably a good thing that most people have got a general basic standard of education at some point, but the way it's imposed and compulsed and mandated, and the erosion of choice, is fundamentally what I take huge issue with, and particularly where that creates a limitation on options and choice.
Right.
And and it is great that we're seeing this entrepreneurial revolution pushing back on that with these great alternatives. And there's some amazing stories that I'm sure you could share from your own experiences, and your new book is really designed to chronicle those stories, if I'm right.
Yeah, the book is brimming with the stories of these founders, who I think, so many readers will be able to relate to. Many of them parents or teachers or both, who, just felt like they could approach education in a different way that sort of reflected the realities of the 21st century, that were much more individualized, personalized. And they went out and did it in sort of true intrepid fashion that entrepreneurs, display. And I think that that's what's so inspiring about this book. Certainly, why I'm inspired by the founders that I talk to, is just that sense of just do it. Many of them have never run a small business before. Some of them have not really, been in education for all that long, but they see that their children are not having their needs met in a conventional classroom. They hear from others in their community that they want something new and different, and they go off and build them, and they find there's tremendous demand. Many of these small schools end up filling to capacity very quickly, and then end up having wait lists, which just shows unmet demand and opportunities for more founders to come in and create their own flavor of innovative schooling. I talked to one founder recently who homeschooled her kids in Minnesota, 4 kids there, and she was a former teacher who kind of came to homeschooling during COVID and lockdowns, as so many did, and then discovered that there were, so many other families interested in this kind of approach. So she ended up creating a homeschooling collaborative, sort of drop-off programming several days a week, very similar to what you are all experiencing in the UK as well. And she now is serving over 100 kids.
Wow.
And this is just in the past couple of years. So there is just so much room for innovation and experimentation in education.
Well, could you, just for those who aren't aware, including myself, there's a variety of different models you've touched upon,
Yeah.
from homeschooling to pods to micro schools. Could you break down the main categories of alternative education and what the key characteristics are of each, so we can get a mental picture of what the options are?
Yeah, and there's just so much overlap in these terms, and again, even different terms depending on different parts of the country and the world that you're in. What we call micro schools, I think, are typically called pod schools in the UK. Um, but there's independent homeschooling, where families take full responsibility for their children's education. Often homeschooling families might become involved in co-ops, or sort of these voluntary collaborations with other families, taking turns educating their children in different homes and different community spaces, maybe hiring teachers here and there, but still very much focused on the parents leading the teaching and learning process. And then you have these micro schools or pod schools or learning pods, all kinds of different names for these programs. But they're sort of maybe one step up from a co-op, in that you might have a much more consistent schedule. You might have, they might be drop-off programs. Parents themselves may not be doing the teaching, maybe hiring educators to run these programs. My understanding is that in the UK, many of these pod schools or micro schools tend to be more part-time. In the US, they could be full-time, up to 5 days a week, as a full-time schooling alternative for a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school. And in some states, again, this depends on sort of regulations at the state level here, some of these micro schools, even if they're, kind of focused on more of this homeschooling model of freedom and flexibility and customized learning, could actually be a state recognized private school. So there's all kinds of overlap there. And then you have, kind of traditional private schools. You have virtual platforms, virtual schools that often offer, full-time learning options for families. So there's a lot happening.
Brilliant. I want to now tap into some of the risks and concerns of the decentralized free market-based approach. So one of the critiques that I see most regularly is one of economic privilege. So having a alternative education school, and there are some of these in the UK actually, like Skyner schools, they're still to some degree have to follow certain protocols to get away with what they do, but that comes with this relatively substantial cost. And there's other smaller pods that may also, due to funding, have a cost attached. Therefore, there's this idea that if you want to put your, and maybe this is unique to the circumstances in the UK with our setup, but if you want to follow these education models, these alternative education models, in lieu of actually just self-educating your children yourself, which may come as a sacrifice, you may have some salary sacrifice if you're giving up some of your work time to do that. There's this perception that alternative education is for those who are privileged enough to be able to afford it. What's your take on that, and what's the prognosis around that?
Yeah, I think that's how it used to be.
Okay.
But I don't think that that's the case anymore. So you brought up Steiner schools. I talk a lot in my new book, Joyful Learning, about Waldorf schools and Montessori schools, sort of some of what we would think of these alternative education models that have been around for decades. And those programs, those schools and spaces tend to be quite expensive. I know, here again, where I am in Boston, Montessori schools and Waldorf schools, the tuition there is over $40,000 a year. These are totally out of reach financially for most families. What we're seeing, though, in this innovative kind of emerging schooling movement are, very low cost programs, even if they're meeting 5 days a week as a private school or some kind of micro school or homeschool collaborative. They are a fraction of the cost of these traditional schooling models. And many of them are right in that sort of sweet spot of these school choice policies that we mentioned earlier around education funding following students. So they tend to be in sort of that $8,000 tuition range per year. That in many cases, these school choice policies cover most or all of that tuition. And it just shows that, education can be done much more cost effectively and efficiently when we eliminate bureaucracy, when we, have sort of smaller, individualized, curriculum models. And many of these founders use, kind of all sorts of creative ways to keep costs down, to engage in fundraising to make these models even more, accessible to more families. So, while I think it's true that if we think about private, kind of traditional private schools, or even these alternative private schools that have been around for a long time, those tend to be cost prohibitive. These emerging models, including many that incorporate Waldorf and Montessori philosophy or other kinds of student-centered approaches, are much more financially accessible to more families.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and absolutely, that's the power of the kind of the market-based approach.
Yeah.
What about quality control? With the standardization, well, the standardization maybe sets a low bar that everyone gets to experience. How do you measure for quality in such an environment? How does a parent therefore discern, other than word of mouth, which is fair enough variable, but how do you discern the quality of an alternative education establishment?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on quality in my new book, Joyful Learning. And I think the simplest way to put it is that families and founders, define quality in all kinds of different ways. And, for some families, quality is, has my child's, mental health crisis passed, and are they happy and flourishing and eager to go to school again? That is what, I define as quality, right? You'll have other families who are looking for, a safer learning environment. Maybe their child is being bullied in a traditional classroom, and then they switch to one of these alternative learning environments, and their child is now, part of a wonderfully inclusive learning environment, and they're thriving. And so for them, quality is this safe learning environment for my child that's free of bullying. For others, quality is standardized test scores and college admission rates and all of that. And that's fine too. I think, one of the things that I find, and of course, the diversity of this movement and the sort of the variety of options available to families is just breathtaking. So there's so much that is different about these learning environments that families are really able to find just what they're looking for to meet their own personal needs and preferences. But one of the commonalities I see in all of these emerging learning models that I've visited and interviewed the founders of is this real sense of joyful learning, hence the title of my book, that these are places that kids want to be. I hear over and over again, kids, not looking forward to summer vacation or holiday breaks because they want to be at school. Or, here where we are, if there's a snow day and they can't go to school, they're so upset. And this is very different from my experience, because I remember we were so jumping up and down for joy when we had a snow day.
Yeah.
And now you have the opposite experience with these kids. These were, often I hear stories from kids who hated going to school. They would get Sunday night stomach aches because they were so dreading Monday morning in their school. And now those stomach aches are gone, right? That's a quality indicator. I had one mom that I talk about in the book who said that her son used to spin around in circles in the morning so much so that he could make himself throw up, so that then he could say to his mom, I threw up, I can't go to school today. And now that same kid, if he's sick and has to take a sick day, is beside himself because he wants to be at school with these friends and these educators. And this is what I hear over and over again, despite wide variety of different educational philosophies, approaches, faith-based programs, secular programs, self-directed, teacher-led, all kinds of different models. And that joy is that common denominator.
Yeah, I mean, that rings true. My son is 3, as I mentioned, and in his nursery, he goes to nursery 4 days out of 5. My wife and I look after him for half a day on the Wednesday where he's not in there. But it's not uncommon for him on a Wednesday to say, I want to go to nursery. I mean, there was one time where he made such a fuss about wanting to go to nursery and not wanting to stay home. We literally had to call the nursery and say, can you have him today? Because he won't let us. He doesn't want to stay at home. Don't read into that. Listen, I'm thinking about the audience. What are you doing at home to make him want to go so bad? But he loves it so much.
Yes,
like he loves it.
Really
and interestingly, when we first moved here, he went to a different educational establishment. And we were blessed in our previous location where he loved it so much. He's clearly got a zest for education. But the place that we chose here, which actually has a philosophy that I align with, was just so badly managed that he just came home upset every single day. And we thought maybe it's just adjustment. It's just taking his time to fit in. But it wasn't that. So when we moved him to this other place, he fell in love with the place again. And he had that love for it again. And he just relishes it every single day. And that's so empowering to hear those stories in those different, this is still within the kind of realms of the system here, but it is a different place that he goes to now. If
I could just comment on that too, Dan. I mean, I think you're talking about, again, this freedom of choice and exit that we see now as this marketplace of decentralized education options emerges, that, you can try something out, and if it doesn't work, you can go somewhere else. Just like, if you don't like your hairstylist, or you don't like your, the barista at your coffee shop, you can go somewhere else. And we're just starting to see that same impact in education.
Yeah, so many parallels. We just interviewed Stella and Lujuan, who's looking at this idea of the digital network state. And I won't get into all the fascination of all those topics, but one of his key variables was designing architectures that had that low or no exit costs, so that you could have that transfer of ease of transfer. Because if you wanted to move from one state to another in the US physically, there's big costs involved, and there's potential ramifications. Whereas in this digital space that they're building, it's very different. So that ability to transfer, making that seamless and easy, that gives you that choice. If it doesn't meet your values or standards, then you can make the change. Now, one of the other issues that comes up, and I understand this again economically, there's a fear that the market may become corporatized, monopolized, and at some point through merger activity, the market, fortunately, I think, is in its infancy, so we're probably a long way away from that. But looking at market forces, and if we get to that point where there is, and initially, I'd imagine there's some benefits. So imagine, you've got one school that's growing, there's another one. It's almost like a mini franchise, so that you get like a consistent experience if you do move from Bristol to Bournemouth, like I did. But what about the end point if it becomes monopolistic? And, are we then just in a privatized version of the standardized state version? Is that a risk that you see or perceive in the free market of education?
I think if we can unleash the power of the free market in education the way we have in other areas of our lives, we will see the continued growth of a variety of education options aligned with each individual family's needs and preferences. So, I'm not worried about the monopoly system there. I think that we will see the growth of sort of more maybe corporatized, I suppose, models of education. Maybe we'll have, sort of the McDonald's chains of micro schools or pod schools, but we'll also have the boutique, small, teacher-run programs, and it's similar to how if we think about. I'll tell you, I prefer Dunkin' Donuts. That's my coffee of choice, and so I'll go to the chain store
Yeah.
Dunkin' Donuts because that's what I like, even though there are these like beautiful boutique cafes in my city, and that's just personal preference, right? I think we're still going to see the market respond to personal preference, and then we'll be able to pick and choose at different times for different needs of our children. So maybe what your 3-year-old needs is different from what your child will need when he or she is 13, or what one child needs versus another child. We're going to have, again, that choice, variety, and abundance that will be unleashed by really cultivating a free market in education.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. And I suppose the last concern I want to raise is the idea, and it's fascinating. I listened to a wonderful podcast with this really intelligent gentleman who was dissatisfied with the way his children were being educated, but he was dissatisfied not only because of the standardized curriculum, but what he perceived to be a politicized curriculum that didn't align with his political values and his personal values. And therefore, he felt like he was unschooling his children when they would come home. And therefore, he was looking for, and he's US based, so he did have more alternatives, but he could then make a decision to move to a different school. And I know as I'm saying that, listeners will resonate with that point, because that's part of the problem here in the UK, the politicization of schools, and people are pulling their children out on that basis. But without getting into the specifics of those reasons, one of the concerns that gets raised is that we then have like a blue school and a red school education. I'm simplifying it just for the purposes of the example. Is that a risk factor that we see, that choice where people can align with their kind of political or social viewpoints, but then for the children, they're kind of being forced into like something they're not old enough to really decide for themselves? Is that a risk you see unfolding?
I don't think so. One of the analogies I like to give is that I hope we get to a point where education is like the breakfast aisle of the grocery store, where you walk into the grocery store breakfast aisle and you have a whole assortment of different options. You have every type of cereal, generic and brand named, organic and conventionally grown. You have oatmeal and granola, small batch granola and industrial produced granola. You have Pop Tarts and breakfast bars and all kinds of things. Or you can go to a whole other section of the grocery store and have something else for breakfast, like bacon and eggs or yogurt and fruit, right? There's so many options. And, we can then decide what is right for us based on our preferences and values. And, I could try to convince you that Lucky Charms are better than small batch organic
Good luck.
granola, and do everything I can to persuade you of that. But at the end of the day, I have the freedom to choose which breakfast cereal or breakfast
Yes.
food I want to eat.
Yes.
And I want that. I'm hopeful for that same autonomy and freedom to occur. That doesn't mean we can't, persuade others that Lucky Charms is better than granola, or vice versa, but that we acknowledge that we all have different preferences and needs. And in every other part of our lives, we're able to meet those preferences and needs in a variety of ways. And we haven't been able to do that in education to this point. And that includes being able to choose a school or space aligned with our very different values and viewpoints. We are a diverse species with all kinds of different needs and interests. And I see now founders and families being able to find programs that really do align with their individual values. So I'll talk to families that choose one school because it's very much focused, for example, on social justice activism. And then I'll see another school that's much more sort of focused on patriotic education and classical texts and everything in between. And this is what's so beautiful about unleashing the free market in education, is we really are able to pick and choose in that way. And then, so to your point about, are we creating, red schools and blue schools, or does that, can create conflict? I think it's the opposite. I think the conflict comes when we force people in government schools to adhere to one set of ideological principles that are being projected because of sort of majority rule. And it's this constant sort of tug of war between different viewpoints, and this battle of the wills between one group of people who has one viewpoint and another group of people who has another. And then we're forcing the losers of that battle to then have their kids educated in a way that we may think is not appropriate. And in fact, I'll give a shout out to Neil McCluskey at the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute, libertarian think tank based in DC, who keeps this running map called the Public School Battle Map, where he looks at conflicts occurring in government-run schools across the US in all sorts of different political ways, where it sort of exposes these battles, this conflict between families and different viewpoints in different parts of the country. And I think that conflict will be minimized, if not evaporate, when we really allow people to pick and choose freely what works for them.
Yeah, great answer. And I also think that, when I look at history, education, children tend to rebel against their prior generation. And I feel like the kids are smart enough to look at what the adults are doing right now, tribalizing and fighting and becoming ultra polarized, and go, screw that, let's just get along. So it's my hope the youngsters see what the adults are doing and go, no, we're not.
I see that too. I have 4 kids, 3 of whom are teens. One's an 11-year-old, and I think that's really true, Dan. As my teens are much more like, I don't know what you all are doing, but they're much more interested in sort of the nuances of conversations and getting along in different ways. So yeah,
good on them. Magic. Keep it up, kids. I've lost my train of thought now on that. Well, I suppose this also addresses another problem here, because particularly in university and college education, there's been issues around free speech and this kind of shutdown of debate. And I suppose the same answer applies, is that if you have this open marketplace of education, you have an open marketplace of ideas. So if one education establishment wants to be more constricted in its choice of subject matter, or one wants to be completely open, then the educational establishment has that choice, and as do the parents and the attendees. Would that be a reflection, you think, how things could pan out?
Yeah, and I think that's somewhat what we're seeing. There's been articles recently in the U.S. about enrollment and applications growing at colleges and universities in the South and in Southeast and Southwest part of the U.S., which tends to be slightly more conservative, slightly, certainly these schools and spaces opened up more quickly during the COVID response. And so they're kind of perceived as being, maybe sort of less left leaning, political left leaning. And we're seeing, that trend here. So I think that's already happening in certain ways.
Yeah, great. And the last kind of point I want to talk about in terms of like one of the variables that people are worried about, which is an interesting one, around technology and education, and to what extent technology should be included in the educational curriculum. At what stage does it get introduced? Because again, if we reflect on the fact that at the moment technology is pervasive, it is part of our future. You mentioned AI and robotics. I think the world that we live in is going to look radically different by the end of this decade, let alone in 10 years, 20 years time. And therefore, young people today are going to grow up into that world. So on one hand, if we deprive that of them, they're not going to be ready for that world. But on the other hand, it's like alcohol. Do they need alcohol when they're 5? No. Do they need to drive a car when they're 10 years old? No. Is there a time that is there a benefit in delaying certain things that are more adult? What's your take on technology and the role of technology in education for schools more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but I'll just go back to parental choice and preferences. We all have different ideas around screen time and technology use for children. And it should be the parents' prerogative to decide, what's right for their children. They're the closest to their children, so they know how their children respond to technology or the ways in which it's good or bad for them. And I think, again, what we're finding now with these new emerging schools and spaces is that they have different policies around technology and screens. Some, completely avoid it, and kids aren't allowed to bring phones or screens at all. And they may not even rely on any kind of online curriculum in some of those schools. And for some parents, that will be great. That's exactly what they want. And for other parents, no, they say, like, as you're alluding to, these are the tools of our culture. Again, to talk about Peter Gray and some of the work that he's written about in terms of learning, he'll say that it would be silly to deprive young people of technology and of the tools of their culture. And then now, thankfully, there are these schools and spaces that leverage technology. And so it's really just being able to identify, what's right for you as a family, and then finding schools and spaces that reflect that. I know, I tend to be in the latter side. I think technology is an important tool of our culture and don't want to deprive my children of that. And so they attend an innovative school. They attend the Sudbury Valley School, which is a Sudbury Model School, the original Sudbury Model School here in Massachusetts. There's now dozens of Sudbury Model Schools around the world, and technology is not limited there, but they find ways of adapting to it and working with it that work for them. And that's, again, reflecting our family values. It may not be right for another family, and that's okay.
That's amazing. I'd like to close by kind of just summarizing some of the key benefits that you're witnessing of people going through these alternative education models and self-directed learning in particular. What are some of the short and long-term benefits that you're seeing for the children and the families that have embraced these models?
Well, happiness is probably the biggest piece, right? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about just how these kids want to be in these, innovative schools and spaces. They're happier than they've ever been. If there were mental health issues for kids who were in a conventional school, those tend to be lessened outside of the conventional classroom. This is, again, something that Dr. Peter Gray has written a lot about. So I think that that's a key feature. I think related to that, we're seeing that the families who are now moving toward homeschooling or other types of alternative education are doing so because they may have tried the conventional model and are dissatisfied with it. They're dissatisfied with a one-size-fits-all undifferentiated curriculum. They're dissatisfied with an increasing emphasis on standardized testing that's happening here in the US and in the UK, and families want to push back against that many times. So they're not always sort of moving toward alternative education in more kind of for ideological reasons. They're doing it because the conventional system isn't working and they want something different. And so I think that is a big piece. They're finding that in that different model, their kids are thriving in ways that they weren't in a conventional classroom. We've known data, sort of more generally around homeschooling specifically because it's been around for a while. And we know, for example, here in the US, we have two primary college entrance exams that students take to enter university, the ACT exam and the ACT and the SAT exams. And data from ACT.org, which is the nonprofit that administers the ACT exam, has found that since 2001, homeschoolers and private schooled students have far exceeded their government-run school peers in the ACT exam results. That's been consistent over the past more than 2 decades now. We have, similar results around homeschooling outcomes more generally, that on average, homeschoolers are outperforming their public school peers and are leading successful lives. So, I think that we'll just have to continue to watch the growth of this movement and be excited by, some of the outcomes there. But I think for the most part, we're seeing more positive outcomes and more to come.
Yeah, the fascinating part about that is a lot of the alternative educations kind of rebel against the standardized testing, and there they go. The children still are adaptable enough to crush it on the tests.
Exactly.
That shows the effectiveness of the applied learning. That really does validate the model so strongly.
Right.
So tell us a bit about who the book is for, and the title. I was when I first discovered the book, I thought we need one of those for adults. Quite frankly, how to live more freely with more joy and happiness. It feels like
Yeah.
everyone needs that right now.
Yeah, so the book is called Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. It's really geared towards founders and families. So, if a parent or a teacher has that entrepreneurial itch to kind of create something new, they know that education can be done a different way, this is the book for them, sort of the how-to guide with lots of inspiration from founders who've gone before them to create their ideal school or space, but also for families looking to find something new or different. How do you identify the right educational environment for your child? How do you assess quality in whatever way you define quality? How do you know that this is the right space for your child? So it's really for families and founders either seeking or building innovative education models.
Fantastic. We've got an international audience, but we'll put the links in the description. So wherever you are watching or listening to this, do look in the description and you'll find the links to the book so you can check that out straight away. I have one closing question for you, which is kind of our end closing question that we ask all our guests, which, the tagline of our show is to live free and prosper. How can alternative education help young people to live free and prosper in this modern world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anytime we can reduce the size and scope of government and take the government out of our individual lives and livelihoods, we gain more freedom and prosperity. When we can unleash a free market that's focused on consent and choice over coercion and compliance, we inevitably unlock human flourishing.
Yeah, if we were in person, I'd be high-fiving and fist pumping right now. It's just right on, such a right on moment. Thank you, Kerry. This has been a very illuminating, enlightening discussion, and so pertinent now. The post-COVID environment. Our content has stemmed from that period in history, and we've looked at every facet of our lives, including education, the impact on children and education and schooling, and many now looking for these alternatives. So bringing people like yourself on is helping people to pioneer, and I know we've got many of those entrepreneurial minds in our audience who have gone ahead and started initiatives. We've got people who have taken on homeschooling. They've made life-changing decisions for themselves and their families, and it's my hope that this interview today has inspired many more to follow that path. So do let us know in the comments if you're already homeschooling, if you're interested to embrace this type of entrepreneurial thinking, and if you're in the UK, tell us what we can do to put more pressure on the government, or in fact, let's just skip the government and just get innovating so that we become so strong that you can't ignore us any longer. But do let us know in the comments what you think of our discussion today, and please do share this. This is a growing topic, and we need to get this word out there. So thanks once again to Kerry and to our audience at home, and to everyone. Live free and prosper.
Thanks for tuning in to today's conversation with Kerry McDonald. If you're one of the growing number of people questioning the role of traditional schooling or actively seeking alternatives, then I hope this episode gave you insight, inspiration, and a renewed sense of possibility. Kerry's book, Joyful Learning, is a brilliant resource if you want to dive deeper into homeschooling, microschools, or building your own education model from the ground up. You'll find the link in the show notes alongside Kerry's other books, such as Unschooling, and I highly recommend that you grab a copy. Now, if you value conversations like this, bold, independent, and uncensored, there are 3 things that you can do right now to support our work. Number 1, subscribe to the show. Number 2, please share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. And most importantly, join our supporter program at danastingregory.com/supporter to help us stay independent, free, and fearless. Until next time, live free and prosper.